and welcome to Macros with Maithili, the ET Now show that takes a hard look at all the major macroeconomic issues and developments in India and overseas. In this edition, we're going to take a hard look at our big neighbor to the east, the superpower we always like to compare ourselves with, China. As Chinese growth for the second quarter of 2019 slowed to a record low of 6.2%, should the world, more particularly India, worry? The answer is not easy. China has always been a bit of an enigma. Inevitably, therefore, theories abound. What should we believe? We've put together a panel of experts to try and make sense of it all. So let me welcome to the show Indrani Bagchi, diplomatic editor, Times of India, also a former colleague, and trade economist Professor Rupa Chanda of IIMB Bangalore, and Manoj Pant, director, Indian Institute of Foreign Trade, New Delhi. Both of whom will help us understand what the ongoing US-China trade tensions mean for China's growth. Let me start by asking each of you the question that I started off with. How worried should we be? At 6.2%, China is still growing at twice the US's rate of growth, but it is half the rate at which it was growing for more years than one can remember. So should that be a cause of serious concern? Let me start with you, Indrani.
Yeah, so China's growth numbers, now the first question of course everybody would ask whether is are they the right numbers, are they not, and I think there is a whole debate on that particular issue. But the fact is that China is slowing down, and there are headwinds that are not only caused by President Trump's trade war, so China's growth is slowing, and yes, that will always be a matter of concern for global growth. Specifically for India, I may not be able to say it in exactly economists' terms, but I think for India, a runaway growth for China always has two problems. One is that it could crash, or two, that it could fuel China's expansionist sort of imperial designs, and that is always an issue for India. So I can't say that India would be happy with a slowing China, but I think a check on China's growth would probably not be such a catastrophe for India.
Rupa, do you agree with Indrani? This is the slowest rate of growth since the Chinese government began releasing quarterly growth data back in 1992. So how should we look at the slowdown? Warily, with trepidation? Rupa?
Personally, I think that this is really nothing but a transition to a new normal that the Chinese economy would have to have gone through. It was not sustainable to have the sort of 10% growth rates that they experienced in the 90s and the 2000s. So this is really more a correction, and I don't think that this is a matter of concern, because China could not have continued to grow at that rate. And let me explain that a little bit, because the whole focus of an investment-led and an export-led growth, which was fueled by a set of conducive circumstances at the time, but those circumstances do not continue anymore. It's not a matter of concern, it's just that we have to accept this as what has to be the new normal, the lower potential growth rate that China has to accept. And therefore it needs a different sort of strategy of rebalancing the drivers of growth.
Quite possibly you're right on that, Rupa, but Manoj, even if it is a new normal, should it be a matter of concern for us, or can we just go on as if it's business as usual? Manoj?
See, I agree with Rupa on one thing, that the production of world structure or structure of world production is changing, and to that extent China has not been able to adjust, and that's why it's slowing down. But you know, the Trump factor cannot be ignored. Let me just give you one number. You know, in January 2018 to April 2019, monthly exports of China to the US have gone down from about $50 billion to $35 billion. Now that's a pretty large amount, cannot be explained only by change in production structure. I do think the Trump factor is important, because a lot of the businessmen are thinking that whatever happens to this battle.
So should we worry, Manoj? My question
was... No. I don't think we should worry, because our problem is the following. Actually,
so should we worry?
No, we shouldn't worry, because we don't have any competing exports. You know, we don't worry. Our own trade going on with USA is too small. Where we should worry, I'll tell you. if 40% of your trade, if your GDP is exports or imports, and the world economy slows down, and China accounts for about 15-20% of world trade, then your economy is also going to slow down. So our worry is not the direct one, but the indirect one, that what is it doing to world trade. That's the real worry to us, because we are also increasingly exposed to global trade. That's the worry for us. What do we do?
Okay, sure. So there are some reasons for us to worry, but Indrani, let me now get down to the specifics. The reason or the reasons for the Chinese slowdown, are these domestic, external? The general belief is that it's been caused by the trade tensions with the US. But is that the only trigger? Do the reasons lie deeper within the Chinese domestic economy? Indrani?
Yes. Yes, I think that is there's certainly that. I mean, after the 2008 financial crisis, I think China poured in ridiculous sums of money into a fiscal stimulus domestically, and I think if I read the figures right, they have a debt of $40 trillion. That I think the IMF said was something like 11 or 12% of global debt. Those are huge numbers, but that also points to sort of flaws within the Chinese economy.
Okay. So Rupa, Indrani feels there are deeper problems lurking below the surface, but the fact is that China's scorching pace of growth over the past 2 decades has been widely attributed to its mercantilist model of development, its conscious effort to keep its currency cheap vis-a-vis that of its competitors. So does the slowdown in growth mean that it's the end of the road for that kind of model?
Okay, so first of all, just to place China's scorching pace of growth on a mercantilist model may be a bit too simplistic, because we always think that because of the currency undervaluation, they were competitive and that's how they amassed their foreign exchange surpluses. But a large part of the foreign exchange surpluses have also come from foreign direct investment and FII inflow. So I just want to place that on record. But yes, it has certainly given them an edge, and the trade tensions do mean that it's going to be harder for them to use this model of growth. But I should also add that these trade tensions are not just with Trump. They've started off with the Obama administration, especially after 2015 when China came up with this Vision 2025 and Made in China sort of strategy. So trade tensions have been building up, and as I said before, the structural reasons within the Chinese economy itself which required a change in production pattern, orientation, these were already there.
Okay, so these tensions were already there below the surface is what you say. But Manoj, let me ask you the same question that I asked Indrani and Rupa. Is Chinese slowdown a result of the trade tensions, or is it a symptom of a deeper structural malaise? Because why this is important is because any remedy will depend on the proper analysis of the reason for the slowdown. Manoj?
Sure. No, certainly, as I said earlier also, it is certainly being driven by the trade war which Trump has ignited. Why it's a worry from the Obama days, when the trade tensions also there, was Obama was willing to work this through the WTO mechanism. Trump is not. He wants to do it bilaterally with India, then with EU, then with Mexico. That is the problem. You cannot set up things bilaterally and expect the multilateral thing to fall in place. That's why Trump is a problem, because he's not willing to work these issues through the multilateral mechanism. That's the one problem that we have. Now, apart from that, let me also mention one thing about China. You see, you're right about the China's global eminence. I think that might be a little overstated because of their role in the export market. In the world demand, although they are important, it is still the USA which is the dominant economy, and Trump knows he can sustain this war, the way he's trying to do it. So it's not as if the China thing is going to, sort of suddenly make the world implode. The world has been imploding since 2008 anyway, and the China story is simply in addition to it. Let me add one more thing. See, this is not what Mr. Trump doesn't understand. It's not a China-US trade war. It's a rest of the world versus US trade war. I'll explain why. If you look carefully at Chinese exports to the USA, the value added in China is less than 5.5%. Krugman did this very well-known study way back in 2008. Most of the world, what has been happening is the East Asian economies, Japan, South Korea, Southeast Asia, many of the Australian economies like Australia providing raw materials have been supplying things to China, inputs. They are assembled in China, and China was the shipping place or assembly point for things to the rest of the world. So it's not as if China is the only one which will be affected. All these other economies are also affected. So it's important not only what China does, but what do these people do? Because the fact remains that China has remained as a major world exporter, but it has not come out as a major world consumer.
Sure. Yeah, so certainly the ramifications go far beyond China and the US. That is very clear. But I'm afraid it's time for us now to slip into a very short break. But please do stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Maithili, and I'm in discussion with a panel of 3 experts on the implications of the slowdown of Chinese growth. What does it mean for the world economy, and what does it mean for India in particular? Indrani, before the break, we were discussing the various ramifications of that. But I think the bigger worry really is what are the implications, the possible implications of China's growth slowdown for its political stability. The West has been waiting for the Chinese system to implode for years. But thanks to its amazing growth that translated into rising prosperity, there hasn't been much of a threat to its political system so far. Will that change as growth slows down? Will we see rising unrest? And what does that mean for the world, for us in India? Will China become more aggressive, Indrani?
Yes, you know, as you said, the world has been waiting for China to explode for a long time, and it hasn't. And I think the reason for that is the Chinese Communist Party are smarter than we think they are. As the Chinese, it used to be said that if Chinese growth went below 6%, Chinese society would implode and there would be social unrest, political unrest. We haven't seen any of that happening, and there have been some pretty tough years in China. And if you look at the nature of the regime, of the Xi Jinping regime, you will see how much more controls have been introduced into Chinese society. They have become much more intrusive, much tougher, and you know, the fact that you don't have Twitter, you don't have Facebook, you don't have any of the drivers of sort of change in the rest of the world. You don't have any of that in China. You do have some of their own social media platforms, but their controls are very savage. I mean, you can within seconds keywords are introduced into the controls, and you will not be able to access messages or posts that relate to such keywords.
You're possibly right on that, Indrani, except that one wonders how long can you suppress dissent, because that is perhaps the only country apart from North Korea where you really have the ability to suppress dissent. But Rupa, another key driver of Chinese growth really apart from exports has been investment, especially in infrastructure. And as domestic opportunities have declined, China has turned to investing overseas, particularly to ensure that there is business for its companies and also to win geopolitical influence, as we saw with its OBOR. But now that we are seeing increasing backlash against this from countries like Sri Lanka and Malaysia, etc., does it mean that's the end of the road on that front too? Will China find it increasingly difficult to invest overseas, Rupa?
No, I do not think so. Though, yes, clearly, you know, there is more recognition regarding the problems with the BRI projects. There's a lot of asymmetry. It's an extractive sort of relationship. There isn't much skilling and capacity building happening in the receiving countries. There are debt liabilities and so on. The governance issues are definitely there, and it's very opaque. You can't find out the terms and conditions. You've got $62 billion in CPEC, and many of the countries are trying to pull out or renegotiate the terms and conditions. But the problem here is that, see, it's actually mutually beneficial. If you look at it, the Asian Development Bank has estimated around $26 trillion worth of infrastructure investment is needed in Asia and Africa. Now, where is that going to come between now and 2030? Who is going to be the supplier? So clearly, Asia and Africa are infrastructure hungry, and this money has to come from somewhere. Now, on the Chinese side, there's expertise in this kind of infrastructure development. They have surpluses. They don't want to get returns on these low-yielding government securities of the United States.
Possibly, Rupa, except that suspicion of China always remains very high, as we've seen with UI. But Manoj, the fact is that, as you mentioned, Chinese exports rose only by about 0.1% in the 6 months to June 2019. And part of the reason for that really is that the MNCs that were using China as a base have now begun moving out. On paper, this should present a huge opportunity for us in India. But what we are seeing instead is that most of these companies are actually moving out to Vietnam. Can we do anything to remedy that, or have we once again lost the opportunity to hop onto this global supply chain, Manoj?
No, see, again, related to my earlier answer, you are right. There has to be a relocation of production globally, because irrespective of what happens to the Trump-China war, companies saying, look, it's probably not a great idea to locate only in China. Diversification always reduces risk. Now, immediately they go to Vietnam, because Vietnam receives their cultural systems much more easily than India does, right? Don't forget, the China, East Asia, South Asia has very similar cultural systems. Now, what does India have to do? If you look at the products, largest products which China exports to USA are things like telecom equipment, automatic data processing machines, furniture, toys, etc. None of these does India export to USA. Our major exports to USA are, for example, one is pearls, then the medicines, as we all know, then processed oil products, some textiles. So, can we take up the capacities? That's the first thing. I don't think in the current production manufacturing sector in India, we have the capacities to make up. Remember, only telecom alone, $83 billion China exports to USA in 1918, just in one item. So, we cannot do it unless the producers who made the Chinese experiment. See, don't think that the Chinese thing was just a Chinese effort. It's part of the whole South Asian, East Asian effort. Can those people locate here? So, unless you are going to get foreign investment and technology, and these companies want to relocate to India, I don't see how we are in a position to take up the capacities that the Chinese are giving up in the near future.
Okay, so there's much that we need to do. But Idrani, on the one hand, there is this fear that rising trade tensions will stall Chinese growth. Some predictions, in fact, speak of a further halving of the growth in coming years. On the other hand, there is this perception that all of this is a bit of grandstanding. Trump cannot really afford to let things go out of hand, because rising tariffs ultimately hurt US consumers the most. And he has an election coming up in 2020. Likewise, it's the centenary of the Chinese Communist Party in 2021, and China cannot afford a further slowdown of its economic growth. So, will these turn out to be only temporary irritants, Indrani?
No, I would disagree. In fact, I don't think it's a temporary irritant. The approach to China, I mean, Trump articulated it in fairly bold terms in 2017 when he came in. But across the political spectrum, across the business spectrum in the US, there is a general consensus that China is basically cheating the world system, and that what Trump is doing to China, frankly, has a lot of support within the US. Second, as Manoj said, I think very importantly, what we don't always see and we don't always talk about is that the US is having a huge bout of economic growth, which is not matched by anybody. And if you look at the base from which they are growing, the US growth is even more remarkable. So yes, Trump can continue down this path for quite some time.
Sure. So maybe it's just wishful thinking on the part of the West. And the question is, will they be happy if they no longer continue to be as wealthy as earlier, the pace of prosperity? But Rupa, let me ask you and Manoj one last question. We already have a huge current account deficit with China. And as Chinese exports to the US decline, will we see that deficit increase as they dump goods into India? And especially if we sign off on the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. RCEP is essentially an FTA with China, and as we've already seen with FTAs that we have with other countries that are part of RCEP, this could really hurt us very badly. Rupa?
Yes, as far as RCEP is concerned, I mean, I don't see how we could gain bilaterally. Our deficit is definitely going to go up. With China, it's already $53 billion or so, and it's likely to go up. But the issue really is we should not look at any impact of an FTA only in terms of bilateral deficits rising or falling, because the market linkages, like for instance, if RCEP enables us to enter into the Asian production network, if it helps us in bringing foreign direct investment from other partners in Asia, the other RCEP countries, and to export to third markets, these are the ways we have to really look at it. But as far as India, China specifically is concerned, yes, several industries are quite concerned, and this could potentially derail the talks and the conclusion of RCEP, with the fact that India is holding off on giving more tariff lines and it wants to put many things on sensitive list. But having said that, can I just also mention that when you look at this whole US-China trade dispute, the repercussions for India are far too many and very complex. It's not just about whether India can fill the capacity in the US market. There's also potentially exports to China that could grow, where the US market is getting affected, which is like some of the agricultural exports, iron ore, etc. So it's a really complex thing, and there's market sentiment which gets affected by the trade dispute, which affects inflows into India and other emerging economies.
Very true, very true. Manoj, your quick response to the implications of RCEP in today's scenario?
See, I've been writing for many years on this. I've never understood these RTAs that we've done so far, whether it was ASEAN or whether it was the Korean one or the Japanese. Total ASEAN trade with India is less than 10% of our total trade. Now, to expect that to make us implode or explode is not going to happen. More important, the major exports that are happening with ASEAN, mainly agricultural exports, are out of the ambit of the ASEAN agreements. So, I had never understood why the ASEAN agreement was done. Why was China, take for example South Korea and Japan, we hardly trade anything with them. Much of our trade, we are always linked with them through foreign investment when nothing is happening. Now, let me quickly mention one small thing. If just give me 2 minutes to comment on Indrani said. See, remember one thing on the political system. We remember one thing very carefully. Barring India, there is no other developing country in the world which has free systems, which has a true democracy with the way that we have in India. Bangladesh does not. Sri Lanka used to have that, does not. Pakistan, of course, does not. No Southeast Asian country has it. Let me tell you, this South Asian model, which is codified in the Chinese communist model, is separate political and economic issues. Let's worry about economic issues today, political issues lead to the center. So, in China, political power is centralized, but economic power is completely decentralized to the states. That you keep your systems going in terms of economics and make people happy, leave the politics, and people seem to agree. Don't tell me why, but they do. So, what I am saying, where I disagree with what someone said, is if the world exports start impacting China, their political system is in trouble, because they are surviving on the grounds that we will keep you rich and happy. If the Chinese do not remain rich and happy, which is based on the export model, their political system is in serious trouble. India is much better off that way. We have no problem. We're not going anywhere either way.
I'm not sure the poor Indian agrees with you, Manoj, on that, but clearly Indrani feels that the Chinese Communist Party is in command, and despite the slowdown, it will ensure that China does not implode. Manoj is not so sure. Rupa, of course, feels that the situation is far more complex and cannot come to a simple black or white conclusion, particularly in a television debate. But thank you so much, Rupa, Indrani and Manoj, for joining me in this absolutely fascinating discussion. Thank you also for watching. Remember, we'll be back next week with yet another edition of Macros with Maithili. Till then, it's thank you and goodbye from all of us at ET Now.